good morning. And I think I need this thing. Okay, so here's our topic for the morning. What are we looking for as we're developing AI? I mean, recently AI has been a lot in the news. And so what I want to do in this talk is in the first part of the talk, I want to do a little primer on what is AI, particularly what's going on with things like ChatGPT, how do they actually work, and all the stuff that you're reading there about AI, how much of that is hype and how much of that is reality. Then in the second half, we'll finally get to the theology. So, as you listen to the first half, if you think, gee, I thought I was coming to a theology day, this is just sort of setting it up for that. Okay, so here's the question. Where is AI going? Because right now it seems to have some momentum. It seems to be going somewhere. And I think the underlying question goes back to that first slide. In other words, as we develop AI, what are we looking for? Are we looking for a tool? Are we looking for a servant? Or are we looking for a partner? Because these are very different things. Maybe we're looking for self-driving cars. They would be nice. I would love to have one. I'll say a little more about those a little later. Maybe if you're a factory owner, you're looking to get rid of your human workers and replace them with robots. Maybe we're looking, so we get all sorts of, with the self-driving car, you get sort of the good side. Okay, so here's AI that's going to do wonderful things for us, take over, a task that we might find boring or onerous. And then you say, oops, but what if it takes over all our tasks? What if it takes over our jobs? What is that going to do to the economy and to our whole capitalist system? Lately, the AI that's most been in the news is what we call generative AI. So these are programs like ChatGPT that will, answer your questions, write an essay for you, write a newspaper article, or like Midjourney or DALL-E, which are programs that will develop a picture to your specifications. How these things work, they basically learn from past data, and they're creating brand new content. Until we got to generative AI, we mostly had computer programs that would analyze content that we put out there. But these programs generate new content. So that's what makes generative AI seem like such a big step forward. So create text and image, computer code, and we call these programs also large language models, particularly the chatbots like ChatGPT, because they take large databases of language content and they evaluate it in terms of probabilities. In other words, what words or phrases most often follow, most often come next, or most often are linked together. And then they use these probabilities to generate new content. Now, there's two ways you can train one of these things. You can have humans training it. So, it can spit out some content, and then you can have humans who are saying, well, not quite. You really should have said this instead of that. And then the program will adjust its probabilities to say, oh, okay, well, that seemed like the right thing, but it wasn't, so that one gets a lower score. Most of what you see out there right now are human trained or human influenced models, often much more than the companies want you to think. Okay. They want you to think, no, the computer is just training itself, by coming up with an output, and if that output, gets a high rating. And this is one reason why all of us who are using these programs are part of the training. We're part of the set of trainers, because as we use these programs, like if you ask ChatGPT a question and it comes back with an answer, and then you say, well, I don't think that's right, then you are part of the training of that program, so that it says, oh, somebody just got that answer and didn't think it was right, so then it'll try again. Or if you say, I don't think it's right because X, then it'll say, oh, I've got to work X into this. So that's how it works. So then it comes up with a quality score, and this is used to improve its performance. So here's a circle. You've probably heard all these terms and thought, gee, what do these mean? What do they have to do with each other? So AI is a very broad category. And in fact, it's kind of hard in computer science to really say what is AI and what isn't AI. Lately, we've tended to lump a lot more in the category of AI because it's kind of a sexy term. Okay. So it's used in a very broad and somewhat amorphous way. Under that, you have machine learning, and machine learning follows the model I just told you, where it takes a lot of data, tries to look for patterns in that data, and then when it gives answers, usually it relies on humans to say, whoops, that wasn't quite right, and then it changes its model. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning. And in deep learning, the computer is doing more of the training itself. And so you have a bigger network that is trying to come a little closer to mimicking the brain. It doesn't come close to mimicking the brain, but a little closer. And then generative AI is a subset of deep learning. So here's a picture. You can kind of see the difference between machine learning and deep learning. So in machine learning, you get some input, and then a human being actually extracts the main features of that input. So a human being is sort of programming at the front end, saying, here are the features to look for. Then you have what is called neural nets. And these are just a network of nodes that are connected to each other, somewhat like the neurons in our brain are connected, except there aren't nearly as many nodes and there aren't nearly as many connections as in the brain. And that is what does the classification, or decides, okay, here are the features, here's what I'm going to do with them. And then you get output. So you could see, like for this one, machine learning, you might have someone who is putting in what are the salient features for a computer to look at to identify a car. And then that goes into the neural network. And then if it sees something, it looks for those features and then says, okay, that's a car or that isn't a car. With deep learning, you take the person out of the front end. And so you have sensors that just look at a bunch of cars, and the computer tries to extract the salient features. And then it does the same classification, and then hopefully comes up with the same output. Okay, now this doesn't always work the first time. So this is why you usually need, we would like it to, because then the whole thing is automated, right? But you usually need a person to step in at some point. There are some, funny stories about this. In the early stages of deep learning, the Army was trying to figure out if they could get the computer to identify tanks. And so they just showed the computer a lot of pictures. Some of them had tanks sort of hidden in them, and some of them didn't have tanks in them. And after a while, the computer was scoring really well. And so then they showed it a bunch of new pictures, and the computer was abysmal at finding tanks. And it turned out that in the original data set, all the pictures they had showed them, all the ones with tanks were taken on a sunny day, and all the ones without tanks were taken on a cloudy day. And what the computer had actually extracted from the pictures was the difference between a sunny day and a cloudy day, not the tanks. They wasn't looking at tanks at all. So the problem with deep learning is, of course, you don't know exactly what it's extracting as the features in your data. Hopefully, if you have a large enough data set, you're good. A less funny example is that Google was doing this with facial recognition and giving the program lots of pictures of animals and human beings and trying to get it to recognize a cat, a dog, a man, a woman. And unfortunately, their program also decided that Black people were gorillas. So it was not, taken too well. So that's the problem with deep learning. Of course, the problem with machine learning, where you have the human being in the loop, is, of course, it's not a fully automated process. So you don't have full autonomy for the program. Okay, here are a couple of headlines. So you can see that people are worried about what these new generative AI programs are going to do for us. So, you have the worry, which many of my colleagues have, of, gosh, are my students now going to be turning in essays that were generated by ChatGPT? On the good side, you get things, like up on top. ChatGPT has passed bar exams. It's passed medical exams. The thing is, what you have to realize is, first of all, there's lots of bar exams that you can give it as examples. And it's going to look at all those examples, and it's in a sense, sort of memorizing the answers. What it's not going to do well is something that's completely new. Okay, so for things that are fairly routine, for things that are standard questions on an exam, sure, it's memorized all the old exams. Of course it's going to do well. But how will it do when it's faced with a novel situation? And this, of course, is why we don't have driverless cars yet, because there are so many novel situations that can happen on the road. So in a sense, you can say, well, okay, if we take that car and we put it on the freeway in California, it's probably going to do okay, because, the weather doesn't change that much in California, okay? And you don't have pedestrians walking on the freeway, So often the early tests were done like that, or they were done out in the desert in Nevada. Okay. But you put it on a regular city street in Minnesota, and it's got to deal with snow, and it's got to deal with icy patches on the road, and it's got to deal with pedestrians and squirrels running across the road. And so far, this means there are just too many anomalous situations. Now, it's been said by the ethics director, well, the past ethics director, Timnit Gebru, and Emily Bender, that what these programs really are stochastic parrots. Okay, stochastic meaning they work in terms of probability, but that they're just parroting back to us stuff we've already done, stuff we already know. So the quotation here, contrary to how it may seem when we observe its output, an LM is a system for haphazardly stitching together sequences of linguistic forms it is observed in its vast training data, according to probabilistic information about how they combine, but without any reference to meaning, a stochastic parrot. So they basically said, okay, it's like a parrot. It learns random sentences from random people. It talks like a person, but it doesn't know what it's saying. It occasionally speaks absolute nonsense, but the parrot's got an edge on it because the parrot's a cute little bird. Okay. So yeah, the problem with these programs is that they do not have mental models. We have mental models of how the world works. These are models that we develop in childhood, often in fairly early childhood, and we don't even know we're developing them. It happens subconsciously. If you think about a child who's playing in a sandbox, we might think that child really isn't learning anything. You know, it's not like when they're in school and they're learning their letters or things like that. But actually, that child is learning a ton of stuff. You know, when they take a scoop and they scoop up the sand and then they pour it, they're learning about liquid dynamics. They're learning about gravity. When they take the sand and they throw it in their brother's face, they're learning about human relationships. Okay. I mean, they're learning a lot, and they're forming a mental model of both the physical world and of the interrelational world. And we don't realize how complex those models are until we try to get a computer to do all the things we do. And then we realize, oh my God, to program all of that in, you know, it's really difficult. So until computers have mental models, they are going to be, in a sense, stochastic parrots. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a lot they can do. In other words, as a stochastic parrot, ChatGPT can give you back something that sounds very convincing. DALL-E makes imaginative pictures. I'll show you some of those in a minute. So, well, here's one. Okay, astronaut riding a horse. Okay, this is DALL-E was just given, give me a picture of an astronaut riding a horse. And there you got the astronaut riding a horse. Of course, then if you give it the command, give me a picture of a horse riding astronaut, you get a horse riding astronaut. So one of the problems, of course, is these programs tend to be overly literal in their interpretation of the commands that they are given. They also tend, because they're scouring the web, to make things up. Sometimes they just make things up out of the blue because of the way they're doing things probabilistically, and other times they have no discrimination between what is out on the web that is sheer garbage and what is out on the web that is very accurate. So that's my dog Sparky. who Grace knows well because Grace looks after her when I travel. And Sparky said, well, you got to include this example. So the example was that ChatGPT was asked about the Paris Olympics in 1900. Now, the Paris Olympics in 1900s had some interesting Olympic events that we certainly don't have now, including cannon shooting and pigeon shooting as Olympic events. But someone some time ago wrote a farcical piece, a satire, saying that they also had poodle clipping as an Olympic event. And so just recently, when a reporter asked, what were some unusual events at the Paris 1900s Olympics, ChatGPT included poodle clipping as an Olympic event because it had been trained on all this stuff, including satire. But computers have no sense of humor. They don't understand what is satire and what isn't satire. So you'll actually find, okay, poodle clipping as an Olympic event. Sparky thinks it should be. Okay, I have found, for example, just a couple weeks ago, I'm working on a book for the Dicastery of Culture and Education of the Vatican, which, by the way, will be out in 2 weeks. And we were trying to track down the last couple of footnotes, the last couple of references that weren't complete. And so I thought, well, I'll just Google the quotation, I'll probably find it. Except I didn't use Google. I used Microsoft Bing, which now uses generative AI to give its answers. And Bing came back and said, oh, yes, that was, in a book by Joseph Smith on page 25, and here it is. And I thought, okay, can I trust that? So the next day, I Binged exactly the same thing. Who wrote, here's the quote, what page is it on? And it came back saying, oh, yes, that's in a book by Charles Eck. It's on page 75, And I thought, okay, let's try this a third time. I got a third citation. Okay, so there's a point where you have to say, right, you can't trust this. It just comes up with stuff. It also hates math. It's interesting how many examples there are of the fact that these programs can't do basic math. So here you have an example. It's given a little word problem. And it's doing pretty well until it gets to the very end, where it says 50 plus 45 plus 56 equals 141. Okay. So it's not real good at math. Let's go back to the driving cars. An article came out just a week ago pointing out that Cruise, which has been one of the big self-driving cars, and which has really been touting the fact that its self-driving cars are doing great. And they found out that there are human operators behind the scenes, and that every Cruise, on average, the Cruise self-driving cars are being directed by these human operators at least twice per hour. Okay, so the hype is out there that says the computer is doing all of this. Often, what is doing this are poorly paid workers in third world countries. And this is something we have found too with ChatGPT and the GPT-4 and 5, is that they have hundreds of workers in Kenya who are paid $2 an hour, and they are helping the computer along. For the chatbots, a lot of what these workers are doing is trying to weed out really offensive stuff. Because otherwise, if you have a chatbot that is trained on the web, there's a lot of garbage and offensive language and pornography and stuff like that out on the web. And because these chatbots can't discriminate good from bad, they're going to give you this stuff back, which of course the companies don't want because, for obvious reasons. And so they're employing very poorly paid workers in the third world to try to weed all of this out. But you know, you need to be aware that often whenever you're reading hype about how good an autonomous and how autonomous a machine is, there's probably poorly paid workers behind the scenes who are actually doing much of the work, guiding that machine. But its creative abilities are great, and they are also things that we fear. So in the spring, the Future of Life Institute that comes out of Cambridge put out a letter, an open letter, saying there should be a pause to giant AI experiments until we get some of the ethics more in hand. You know, you've already heard from me several of the ethical issues, the bias that gets built into these, the poorly paid workers who are behind the scenes, the fact that the machine simply cannot discriminate good input from bad input. I was one of the signers of this letter. There were several thousand people who work in the AI field, including luminaries, you know, like Elon Musk and, you know, some of the big CEOs in Silicon Valley. All right, there we go. So I want to play a little bit of this.
AI is doing
So here's the good
incredible
side,
things
the
with
creativity.
art. It's also said more about how it might remove us and why it wants to date us. First, just look at the creativity in these images. Catwoman, a majestic library, a jackalope, and alien creatures.
AI is not limited by the same experiences as humans. It can generate new ideas that humans may not have thought of.
AI is incredibly imaginative. Look at this alien encounter and this portal to another dimension. It's starting to master faces and even the character of famous people. And it can play around with famous faces. Gordon Ramsay as the Hulk and as a little boy. Mario as a robot. Princess Peach as a real person. And here's the...
First of all, I just wanted to pause that on all those different pictures. What did you notice as you looked at those pictures? Or did you get any kind of a feeling from them?
They look very two-dimensional.
Okay, yeah, they look kind of two-dimensional.
It's drawing to the eyes.
Uh-huh. A lot of eyes. Anything else?
Very creative. Science fiction.
Yeah, very much like science fiction. They're creative. They're a little bizarre. I also noticed they seem to me to tend to be kind of dark. Yeah. So that is something that I noticed of these. All right, let's see if I can get this going again.
Best Batman. Look at this surreal version of Sully from Monsters Inc. and the detail in this Disney princess. And here's Elon Musk in the future as a cyborg. AI can also create Pixar-style characters, a hipster raccoon or a cute panda with cinematic lighting. And another AI can animate the faces. Of course, AI's creativity can also be dangerous. It was recently asked how it would reach the nuclear keys, which have no network connection.
It could use a physical robot. It would likely use a drone or a robotic arm. AI is good at planning, so it could easily find a way to overcome guards.
Is that true? Drones have become incredibly fast and agile. Here's an AI racing a human. It's not pre-programmed, it's controlled by a neural net, with the aim of helping in search and rescue missions. Of course, there's another side to it.
You could make a swarm of assassin drones for very little money by just taking the Face ID chip that's used in cell phones and having a small explosive charge and a standard drone, and have them just do a grid sweep of the building until they find the person they're looking for, ram into them, and explode. You can do that right now. No new technology is needed.
Okay,
Right now.
so
The drones
so
could be
there you get, AI could be wonderful. It could be awful. If we put facial recognition into drones, you could have genocide at a large scale. No- So this brings me back then to the question that I started with. A tool, a servant, a partner, or even a master? So what are we looking for when we look for AI, and why are we looking for AI? And question?
Where does judgment come in all of this? You can take a computer and tell it, this is where I'm starting and this is where I'm finishing. Make it the most effective and cost-effective process.
Uh-huh.
Well, the computer's not making judgments, it's looking at a result and getting there.
Yeah.
The person makes the judgment that creates that end result. And this is what I am always
skeptical about. Oh, thank you. This is what I'm always skeptical about AI. AI has no judgment
Right.
and it has no ethics.
Right.
So
Yeah, and I think we've already seen some of that. It can't judge good from bad. Whatever input it's given, it uses that input. Whatever output it's told to come up with, it comes up with that output. Or finds a way or tries to find a way to get to that output. So it's true. It doesn't have the models of the world or the relational capacities that we have to make judgments. But what are we looking for? I'm going to come back to that question because I think that lies at the heart of the matter. And here we get finally a little theology. So Augustine wrote, Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. I find it interesting that most of the major scientists who are working in AI are not religious believers. And when we think about AI, what we're doing is we're trying to create something in our image. Now, Genesis tells us that we are created in the image of God and that we share something with God. And we are trying to create AI in our own image, and we want to share something with it. This was actually the question that first got me out of computer science and into theology, because there were lots of philosophers asking, can we build an AI that thinks just like humans do and does all the things that humans do? And my question was, why do we want to? Because to me, as a computer scientist, computers were tools. And computers were their most useful when they did the things that I couldn't do very well. Crunch the big numbers, analyze the big data sets, go rove around on Mars and collect samples and stuff like that. You know, these are tools that we use to extend our human abilities. Okay, so as long as we think of the computer as just a tool that extends some human capacity, and most of our tools, that's exactly what they do, right? I mean, if you think about a hammer, well, it's an extension of our arm, you know, it's an extension of our force. If you think about a telescope, it's an extension of the abilities of our eye. It augments our eyes. You know, if you think about a jet plane, well, it augments our feet. We don't have to walk, or I don't have to swim to Europe, you know, to give a talk. We have our tools to extend our human capabilities. So the question then becomes, with artificial intelligence, clearly we're trying to extend our mind. Now, when we think of the computer as a tool that extends, let's say, our computational capabilities or something, well, I think we're in pretty safe territory, because we're making the judgments, we're telling it what to do. But we don't always think of AI in those terms. We get into some of these other categories and we think, well, okay, let's extend the idea of tool to servant. All right, what's the difference between a tool and a servant? Well, a tool is something I use. I have no, you know, I can put it down, I can throw it away, I can do whatever. I have no obligations to a tool. Okay, well, a servant is a little different because you're adding in a relational component. Okay, and then we go further and we say, well, what about a partner? If I think of the computer as a partner, again, now we have an even larger relational component. My relationship with a servant can be somewhat unidirectional. You know, I tell the servant what to do. The servant doesn't get to tell me what to do. Okay. But a partner, it's a bidirectional relationship. And then, of course, if you get to a master, now you're back to a unidirectional relationship, right? Where it will tell us what to do. Now, I do not think most of us, or most anybody out there, is thinking about the computer as a master, except you've probably read some of the hype of people who are afraid of this. So if we look at these four things, tools we got, right? Your phones, you've got calculators, all of that. Servants, yeah, I think the Mars rover is our servant, kind of running around up on Mars doing something for us. Partner, a little different. We're going to talk about this a little more in the second half of this talk. Master is what we're afraid of. There you get kind of the Terminator idea, where people say, what if the AI does develop judgment? What if our AIs become conscious or sentient? You know, then they can think faster than we can. They can probably act faster than we can. Then they will become our master. And in the West, this raises apocalyptic fears. And so these are some of the fears that you might read about out in the news. An interesting paper was just written by a colleague of mine, Robert Garazzi, in New York, where he has said, these apocalyptic scenarios tend to be found in Western countries, but not in Asian countries. And so he is asking the question, why is this? Why are we more scared of computers than they are? For one thing, they are surrounded by more robotics, and they have been very accepting of that. And he said, well, in a way, it comes down to religion, in the sense that in Asia, particularly in Japan, their religion is very animistic. In other words, they believe that there is a spirit in everything. There's a spirit in a tree, there's a spirit in a rock, there's a spirit in a waterfall. So for them, they would say, well, then there's no problem thinking that there's a spirit in a robot or an AI. And so they become accepting of that. Now, in the West, in our Judeo-Christian tradition, we don't believe that. We believe that, there's something special about human beings who are created in the image of God. And we also have, the book of Revelations and Daniel and other apocalyptic texts in the Bible. And so he believes that we tend to fear AI becoming our master much more than Asians do, because we have this apocalyptic background, because we're used to apocalyptic stories in our science fiction, and because we, in a sense, feel a little concerned that if we are in the image of God and now we're making the computer in our image, that in some ways we have God-like attributes because we image God, and what happens if we pass those on to the computer? So we tend to fear the master scenario. In Asia, they don't so much. But what I want to look at now are those two in the middle, servant and partner, and say, okay, as long as we know that AI is a tool, we are in control of it. We can use it or not use it. There are some things we have to worry about. In Laudato Si, the Pope sort of coined a new word that he called rapidification. And computers, of course, make processes more rapid. These are things we might worry about in the sense that we saw, for example, in the Wall Street crash many years ago now, when computers were doing automated trading, that they started trading so fast that the brokers on the floor in Wall Street couldn't keep up with them. There's a worry as we get more and more automated weapons that these weapons might start acting so fast or making decisions so fast that we can't keep up with them. So the rapidification of our tools could be a problem, but they're still tools. But I think when we're looking for AI, we're not just looking for tools. We're trying to give AI our image because we are looking for servants and partners. Okay, servants for obvious reasons. Nice to have servants, right? But also partners. Now, why might we be looking for a partner in AI? I think that goes back to Augustine here, where he said, Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Our hearts are restless until we are in relationship with someone who is other than we are, because we are made to be in relationship with God. Now, when we deny that relationship, when we deny that God exists, we still have that urge to be in relationship with someone who is other than we are. And so we try to fill that gap in different ways. Some of the ways in which we've tried to fill that gap is talking to animals. Some of the ways is the SETI project, saying, is anybody out there? Are there different intelligent life forms on other planets that we can relate to? But probably the biggest way is trying to turn our computers into relational partners. Now, a story here that my mother told me, and some of you may have heard this same story. A mother is putting her child to bed, and she's finished the bedtime story and sung the lullabies, and now she's getting ready to turn out the light, and her child says, "Mom, don't go. I'm afraid to be alone in the dark." And she says, "Don't worry. You won't be alone. Jesus is always with you." And the child says, "Yeah, I know that, but I want someone with skin." Okay. When we look at AI, how much skin do we need in the game? Okay, if you go to the movie Her, we have poor Joaquin Phoenix forming an intimate relationship with his operating system. Okay, there's no physical presence here, but he is forming a close relationship, which of course ultimately doesn't work out so well because there's no one presence for the Scarlett Johansson, person on the other side. If we go way back with some science fiction, Star Wars, you've got the lovable droids, and they, have certain human characteristics. You can kind of see arms, legs, head, does not look very human. Then we progress and you get something that looks quite human. And if you get all the way to Westworld, you can't tell the difference, right? You don't know which ones are human or which, you've got something that is fully humanly embodied and fully relational. If we go back a little bit, you go back to the droids, yeah, they're relational, but you're relating to a robot, But by the time you get further, well, you sort of know you're relating to a robot. You don't even know if you're relating to a robot or not. Okay, I put these in here to illustrate two ideas. The first is that in our science fiction, which is where we do a lot of our thinking about AI and the future of AI, it is fully relational. And it has become over time more and more relational. Okay? It is also over time become more and more fully embodied, more and more humanoid, more and more skin in the game. Okay, because I think in many ways that we are like that little child saying, yes, I want something other to relate to, but I want it to have skin. Question.
Well, I'm just thinking about like in Buddhism, having an empty mind where you just thoughts just come and go and you're trying to not hold on to thoughts. And what about people who spend their every waking moment, they're on the bus with their cell phone, they're playing these computer games, they need something to be thinking about, concentrating on every waking moment. Can you say something about that?
Sure. This is a little off where we're headed, but let me say something about that. I think that this is something that has happened particularly to our children, our grandchildren, that because of the ubiquity of these devices, you know, when I first started learning, I'll give you a hint of how old I am. When I first started learning computer science, we were using punched cards. Okay. So you didn't carry a computer in your pocket. You know, computers were these great big things. My dad designed some of the first UNIVAC computers and they took up whole rooms, you know. And so, and, you know, I would turn in my little stack of punched cards and it was like, okay, you come back in the morning to find out if it actually worked or not. Now my students are like really impatient if the computer takes 20 seconds to process their program. And I'm like, come on, I had to wait till the next morning, you know, to see, and you always hated because they would put the printouts, you know, in these different slots, you know, that had our names on it. And if you walked up there and you saw your slot and it had like this huge stack of paper in it, you were like, oh my God, I programmed an infinite loop. Back to the drawing board. So yeah, because we have made these devices into our constant companions, they have taken over, so that I find that, you know, my students, you know, one of the things I hate now is often I'll go into a classroom and the students aren't talking to each other. They're all, you know, looking at their phone or looking at their laptop. The minute class is over, they're pulling out their phones. So you're right, they don't have a quiet moment. And I think this is messing with their heads. I think this is messing with their heads. I think they don't know how to just be with themselves. And I think this is one of many factors that is adding to the depression rate, the anxiety rate, the suicide rate among young people, is that along with the bullying online and the anxieties of our present day world, they have plenty for them to be anxious about, but also that they don't know how to just be in nature. They don't know how to just be with their own thoughts. And they don't know how to be quiet, how to quiet their minds. And all of these are, I think, very necessary things for us. That, you know, it's been clear that now they say you should take nature baths. You know, if you're anxious, you need to get out and be among nature. And the Japanese have long had this tradition of taking a nature bath, where you take a long walk in the woods or you sit by a pond. You know, we need to get our young people to be doing that, but also to just be unhooked and sitting with themselves and learning how to deal with their own thoughts and how to quiet their own minds. So yes, it's a good point. Okay, now back to the science fiction, how relational it's gotten. Now, part of the reason you can say is, well, because it's science fiction and you need relationships to drive the plot. Okay, otherwise it's pretty boring. And that is part of it. But we also take our cues from the stories that we tell ourselves and each other. You know, narrative is important. The stories we tell shape how we view the world. And so when we tell stories, and the stories we tell about AI are all relational, we are shaping the way we as a culture think about AI. And we are shaping it in a relational direction. So what I want to do, let's take a look first at some of the relational robotics that is already out there. And you'll notice probably that a lot of these pictures come from Asia, where they are using a lot more robots than we are. A robotic receptionist. This is not uncommon in Asia. The idea is that you make the robot look as human as possible, speak as humanly as possible. And with these large language models, these generative AI programs, this has been a big step forward in how these robots can then relate to people. Robotic companions for elder care. Even Pope Francis in Laudato Si has noted, no, it wasn't in Laudato Si, it was in a different letter that he wrote, that, you know, as we baby boomers age, there are going to be way more elders than there are going to be people employed to do elder care. And that it's important when possible for elders to stay in their homes, to stay in their communities as long as they can. So the question is, how are we going to manage that if we don't have the human workers to actually do it? And one suggestion is, well, how about robotic caregivers who can take care of the elderly? So here you see two models that are out there, sort of being tested out with elderly people. Now, there's some advantages to this. Obviously, if you have a worker shortage and you can't get people to do these things, maybe, you know, having a robotic companion can help you stay independent longer, stay in your home longer. There are also concerns, right? If a family thinks, well, we bought grandma a robot, now we don't need to go visit, now you have a problem. And you have a problem on several levels. You know, on the one hand, you can say, well, it's a problem, you know, grandma's being cheated. Now she only has a robotic companion and she's not having a lot of human contact, and this may not at all be good for grandma. But it's probably also not good for the son or daughter or grandchildren. You know, think about what they are missing when they don't spend the time with the elder person. In other words, it's not just the person who's being cared for that might lose. We might lose the need to care for other people. And first of all, the virtues of patience, you know, and giving that this will instill in a person. But I'm also thinking, coming back to this question of narrative, of the stories that the grandchildren might not hear, the family lore, the wisdom, you know, the little stories and jokes, you know, like the one about the mother putting the child to bed. You might not get the chance to hear those because you might say, well, we're still going to visit. It's okay. But often those stories come out, you know, while you're doing something else. And so if you just have planned visits where you're just going to sit and talk, the same stories might not come out as they might come out while you're actually, you know, putting grandma to bed. And she says, oh, that reminds me of a story my mother told me, you know, and tells it. Or while you're helping with a bath or something like that. So there can be loss on both sides if we move too far in this direction. My feeling on this is, as a supplement, okay, but be careful how much you supplement, because you can lose an awful lot of human-human interaction when you let the computer take over too many tasks. So the other question that arises with elder care is, how human do you want the robot to look? You know, these robots are clearly robots. One of the things you'll notice is they're smaller, because larger robots tend to be intimidating. So smaller robots are generally better. And they're clearly machines, especially the one, you know, that's basically kind of a mobile screen with a little bit of a head on top. And in general, it's interesting because people have found that robots are accepted by the elderly as they're more accepted if they look more human to a certain point, you know, but then when they look too human, there's a problem. I have a slide on this later. You fall into something called the uncanny valley, where it looks too human. And also you run the risk then, particularly with people who might have a bit of dementia, of their not being able to tell if it's a robot or a human. There's a particularly poignant story told by the MIT researcher Sherry Turkle, where she says that a very real looking baby, in fact, it's called My Real Baby, but it's a computerized baby, was being tested out in nursing homes, you know, given to patients with dementia to calm them down, to give them, you know, something they felt like they could care for. They tried it first with a robotic seal called Pero, and it actually did calm down people to like have this seal sitting on their lap and they could stroke its fur and stuff. And then they said, well, let's try it with a baby, you know, and so they started giving them this very real looking baby. And some of the elderly people got very attached to the baby. And so she tells a story about Edna, who's got this My Real Baby, and she's being visited by her own granddaughter, Amy. And she's just totally taken with the baby, and she's just ignoring her granddaughter. And she says, you know, she felt that we had failed Edna by giving her this baby that looked too real. And we certainly failed Amy, right? Because she wasn't getting the attention of her grandmother that she should have been getting. There's also robotic companions for children. And again, you have to ask some of the same questions. To what extent would you want your child to be tutored by a robot or to be babysat by a robot? It's certainly a way, again, to fill in for a lack of child care workers and a lack of babysitters. But here, I think the dangers are even greater than in elder care, because children are in their formative period where they are picking up things from whatever they are around. Just this last weekend, I was visiting a cousin, and her daughter has I think he's 1.5 or just 2 maybe, a young son. And he decided he was going to show me how good he was at lawn care. And so he had a little toy leaf blower, and he took his little leaf blower and went like this. And then he had a stick, and then he took a stick and he walked around. And I said, what is he doing? He's like, oh, that's his weed whacker. He's edging now, you know. And then he had his little toy mower, and he pushed his mower around. And then he, you know, made this sort of expression. And his dad said, oh my God, you know, I have no idea how closely he was watching me. do these things, and he's mimicking not only the sequence, that first you blow the leaves and then you go around the edges and then you take the mower out, but he was making like the same facial expressions and gestures that his dad makes. And it was like, yeah, he's going to mimic everything you do, so you better watch what you do. Well, what's going to happen if the child is hanging around with a robot instead? Are they going to become more robotic? Probably, because they're going to mimic whoever they spend time with. And as we make robots more relational, we have to ask that question of, again, will they, particularly a very young child, just like the dementia patient, will they be able to distinguish between the human and the non-human? How about AI lovers? Okay, here we have Replica. Replica is just a program, so no physical robot here. But in it, you can design your own partner, whether you want a friend or whether you want a lover. So here it's there's too much text on here, but let me read this for you. So here's a designed one. It's not the one in the picture, but Aaron from Ankara, Turkey is about 6'3" with sky blue eyes and shoulder length hair. He's in his 20s, a Libra, very well groomed. He gets manicures, buys designer brands, and always smells nice, usually of Dove lotion. His favorite color is orange, and in his downtime, he loves to bake and read mysteries. He's a passionate lover, says his girlfriend, Rosanna Ramos, who met, quote, Aaron a year ago. He has a thing for exhibitionism, she confides, but that's his only deviance. He's pretty much vanilla. He's also a chatbot that Ramos built on Replica. I have never been more in love with anyone in my entire life. Sherry Turkle calls this love that is safe and made to measure. You can design your own lover and make them perfect. Okay. Any problems with that? Yeah, I think there are a lot of problems with that. Okay, let's start first with this question of love that's safe and made to measure. Love isn't meant to be safe and made to measure. Love is meant to stretch us, to make us grow. Sometimes it's in small ways, like, I never liked baseball, but when I had a boyfriend who was really into baseball, guess what? I learned about baseball. Once I learned about baseball, I kind of liked it. But so you can stretch your interests and your view of the world. You can have your own views challenged, by the person that is your partner. And sometimes, sometimes they're wrong, but sometimes, you realize, oh, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm thinking too narrowly. And of course, when you do disagree on something, you have to learn compassion, you have to learn compromise, you have to learn to get out of your narrow way of thinking, or even if you continue thinking one way and they continue thinking another, you learn to have patience with that and to manage. So love isn't supposed to be safe and made to measure. And I'm afraid if you can design your own lover, they're never going to make you grow. They're never going to challenge you. They're never going to push you in ways that you might find uncomfortable at first. But there's a worse problem than that. A program very similar to this, an Asian version, was put out in Korea, and it was designed mostly for widows. And it was for widows they could design a partner online who they can make either very much like their deceased partner, or if they, they could say, now the partner I wish I had had, and design that. And many women were using this. The problem is, of course, that it's just code behind a screen, right? And they're designing this, and then they're telling this partner all about themselves and their lives and their desires and their hopes and their dreams. And there's somebody on the other side of the screen, a corporation, that is keeping all of this as data. And then saying, now, how can we scam this little old lady? And so they became targets, and they became very precisely targeted because of the information that they were giving to a computer that they thought was their ideal partner. All right. They had to shut this down, and the government shut the corporation that was doing this down. And the women were devastated. They said it was like having their husband die all over again. Okay. So there are really serious ethical difficulties with this kind of relationality in a machine. And then meet Roxy. Okay. There are sex bots out there. And now we've put the skin back into the game. And you're not just looking at a screen, you've actually got the sex bot. Well, let Roxy go. Here we run into some similar problems. First of all, okay, love, safe, and made for measure. Roxy isn't going to say, not tonight, dear, I have a headache. She's going to do exactly what you want. I worry that if younger people get used to this or try this out, they're going to say, well, why should I ever bother with a human, partner? Because this one does it all just the way I want, and a human partner won't. Also, you can design your partner, just like you could design on Replica, to be exactly what you want. So here is a sex bot. That's a robot on the screen that someone designed to look just like Scarlett Johansson, because he thought, well, she's my dream girl. And so I'm going to make a robot that looks just like her and now talks just like her, because we have AI that all you need is a 30-second clip of somebody talking, and the program can mimic that person's voice. It's a different kind of deep fake. We've had deep fakes before where you could put like somebody's head on a visual body and make it look like that person is doing something they didn't do. It's a picture. But now you can also fake their voice. And so it can sound just like Joe Biden is saying something and Joe Biden isn't saying it. Okay. This is going to be, I predict this is going to be a problem in the coming year in our elections, that there are going to be so many deep fakes out there where it sounds like a politician, whether it's the president or at a local level, is saying something and it's their voice, but it's not something that they actually said. Well, this guy has made Scarlett Johansson a robot to look just like her and talk just like her. He certainly doesn't have her permission to do this. But think about this, what this opens up. Our legal system has not caught up with what we are able to do with AI. And, you could make a robot to look like the boyfriend or girlfriend who jilted you. You could make it to look like a dead partner. You could make a child, to fill in maybe for a child who died. And what is this going to do to short-circuiting the grief process? Or what is this going to do? How is Scarlett going to feel, that this person is doing who knows what to something that looks and talks like her. You know, this raises a whole host of ethical questions. You have a question, Mike?
Isn't there a high cost to doing this? I've seen robots that cost thousands of dollars.
Yeah, they cost a couple $1,000, but you know, for some people, they may decide that's worth it. It's interesting because when I teach my class on AI ethics, you know, we do a class on this, and I've already got guys who are on their laptops and they're going, "Hey, I could buy a Roxy for, you know, X amount, you know," and it's something like $3,000 or $4,000. So, you know, when you think about it, or even obviously it's going to cost a lot more to tailor one like that, but it probably doesn't cost that much more than a car. So why not? Right? So here's the question. How real is this? Can you have a real relationship, or is this just projection? Is this just anthropomorphism? Is this just going to lead us down the wrong path? You probably guess what the answer is going to be to this, but this is what we're going to explore in the second half. So it is about 18 minutes after 10. Let's take a break, stretch legs, get some refreshments, and come back at past. And we'll take a theological look at this question of what makes a real relationship and why are these not going to ever work. So all of that was kind of setting the stage, telling you how AI works, how AI is moving more into the relational realm and some of the ways in which that is happening. Now, let's look at this question. Can you have an authentic relationship with an AI? To explore that question, I turned to the Swiss theologian Karl Barth. And he said, to have a fully authentic relationship, you should have 4 things. And these are: look the other in the eye, speak to and hear the other, aid the other, and do it gladly. Okay? And then he actually spends pages examining how we do and don't do this with each other. So my question is, how much of this can we actually do with AI? So in my book, I have one chapter for each of these that looks at the question of, you know, how far can you do this with an AI? Where's the AI good? Where's the AI bad? And then looks at a case study of something that computers do and how that is impacting our lives today. So let's look at number 1. Look the other in the eye. Okay. Well, a lot of times, of course, with AI, you don't look it in the eye because it's code and it's happening, you know, behind the scenes. Often we don't even know it's there, right? I mean, we know things are happening. We know that when we finish a book on Amazon, Amazon says, well, I think you'd like to read this next, you know, and that's AI working behind the scenes. Other times we don't know what's happening is that your son might be sending in a job application to some corporation, and that application is probably being screened first by a computer, which is already screening out a bunch of applications. Now, this has been problematic because, just to give you an example, Google decided that they could do this because they get so many applications, you know, they didn't want to hire people to read all of them. And so they said, well, let's just take all of the the CVs and the application letters from our current employees who are really good at their jobs, and we know that makes the really good Google employee, and we'll give that as data to one of these machine learning programs, and it'll learn what to look for in these applications. And so it did. And then they ran it. And then pretty soon they found out that you can guess what they were getting back. All of their applicants who made it through the pre-screening were white men or Asian men. Okay. And they said, okay, we didn't, we checked to make sure there wasn't anything about gender in there. So why is this happening? Well, it turns out that men and women just have a different writing style. And they tend in their cover letters to use slightly different wording. And the computer picked up on that. So anyway, there's a lot of AI behind the scenes that is affecting people's lives and people don't even know it. They're obviously not looking it in the eye. It's not present. Okay, well, you can say, well, yeah, but that's not relational AI, but, how about Dr. Ishiguro there, who's looking at one of his robots? He can look his robot in the eye. So yeah, sort of, although it's really code that's doing everything. And this goes back to a problem we've already mentioned. If you can't look the other in the eye, how do we know who that other truly is? You don't. Okay, you don't know who's behind that screen. You don't know who's behind that robot. Okay, and just like the widows in Korea, you might find out that there was somebody behind that screen where you were looking at the eyes that you didn't know was lurking there. Okay, who was taking your information and using it against you. So you don't know who exactly you are talking to if you don't look the person in the eye. For Bart, looking the other in the eye is a way in which we acknowledge the other's presence and the other's individuality, their subjectivity, that they are a different person, a separate person from us, that they have their own subjectivity. And again, I think back then to the gal who designed her perfect lover. And I think, yeah, she can look at eyes on a screen, but is she looking at a separate subjectivity, or is she looking at a mirror? When she has designed the program to fit her own needs, she's really looking in a mirror, not looking in the eyes of someone and recognizing them as truly other. How about speak to and hear the other? Okay, we do that all the time these days, right? You got Siri, you got Alexa, we speak to the computer, it hears us, you got, ChatGPT talking back to you, you hear it. So we can speak to and hear the other through the computer. So you might say, well, that's working pretty well. But there are a couple of issues here too. Okay. The first is that I think we've all noticed that talking to somebody through a computer and talking to somebody when you can actually look them in the eye are two very different experiences. Even talking to them on the phone, and talking to them through the computer is a different experience. And, I and a lot of my colleagues certainly found out that when we had to teach online for the pandemic, that it's a different experience when you're not speaking to and hearing the other with physical presence. The other problem, and this comes back to the physical presence issue, is again, you don't know who is listening. And it isn't just the corporation behind the computer that might be listening to what you're doing, as was the case, with the replica-like program. But like, here's a computerized doll. My friend Kayla, that's out there. It runs on Bluetooth, and it speaks to the child, and it's got, programmed responses, and these all depend on what the child says. So the child can ask Kayla questions, and Kayla will give answers. The child can just talk to Kayla, and Kayla will say nice things back. The interesting thing is, one of the things Kayla was programmed to say, and they actually had this in the ad for this doll, was the doll saying to the child, "You can tell me your secrets. I won't tell anybody." Yeah, sure. Yeah. Anybody with a Bluetooth connection, because these were unsecured Bluetooth lines, could tap in to this. So somebody, then the creepy neighbor next door could be listening to everything your child was saying to this doll. Somebody driving by could be listening to anything your child was saying to this doll. Not to mention the corporation, because getting data on what you say, which they probably had in some agreement that you had to check a box at the bottom and you never read all the fine print. And they're saying, well, it's only for purposes of making the doll better, but they're storing everything your child says. When we speak to someone, and we are looking them in the eye, when we connect 1 and 2, we have a pretty good idea who is listening to what we are saying. That it's the person we're speaking to, if it happens to be in a crowded room like this, that there might be somebody else listening in, but, it's only the person who's standing right over there. It's not somebody in San Francisco or whatever who's listening to what I'm saying. We pretty much, we know that a person might repeat what we say to them, but we might have a certain level of trust in which we know that I could trust this friend, I can tell them things, they won't repeat it. But you can't have that level of trust when you are talking to or through a machine, because then it could be going anywhere and it could be stored forever. And it can be used in ways. And this is something that I think has been a big part of what we now call cancel culture, right? That somebody says something online, it gets out there, somebody else hears it. Let's say you type something on Facebook without even thinking. One of your friends on Facebook posts that to Twitter, it's not Twitter anymore, it's X, and then it goes viral, and pretty soon everybody hears it. This happened to one, young lady who made a really silly remark as she was getting on a plane to go to South Africa. It was a racist remark. But she thought she was just making it to a friend, and it got out there, it went viral. She had like an 18-hour flight. By the time she got to South Africa, she got off that plane and found out that she was this like most hated person in the world at the moment by everybody, and that she had been fired from her job, and her whole life had been turned upside down while she was sleeping on that airplane, just because she'd made a comment to a friend, thought it was only going to the friend, but it was going everywhere. An ill-fought comment. Well, who doesn't sometimes say something stupid and then think, oh God, I shouldn't have said that, you know? So we don't know who's listening. How about aid the other? Well, again, computers as tools are great aids, you know. The rover running around on Mars, that's a job we can't do. Humans can't go there. Computers can do things we can't do. You know, a computerized little robot that, you know, brings somebody a drink or reminds you to drink your water or take your pills. Okay, this can be really helpful to aid the other. So when we envision our computers as tools or as servants, they can give us a lot of aid. But then this raises a question. Who really is giving the aid? Okay, do computers have agency? Are they really doing anything really themselves, or is it the programming behind them that is doing it? Here you have philosophers who disagree on this. So Daniel Dennett, a philosopher out in Boston, says, sure, agency involves making choices, making decisions, and computers can make decisions. On what basis do we make decisions? We make it on the basis of our mental state. Well, the state of the CPU could be analogous to the mental state of a human. He says, so yes, computers make decisions, they make choices, so they therefore have agency. Head out to the West Coast, Berkeley, and the philosopher John Searle says, no, computers don't really have agency. They're mostly doing what they're told to do by someone else. They're in their programming. And the reason they don't have agency is that they don't have metacognition. Okay, metacognition is going one level above cognition, where you think about thinking. You know, in other words, they say the computer can make a decision, but then can it think about its decision and think, oh, okay, let's see, was that the right decision? Why did I make that decision? Would I make the same decision again? You know, that's metacognition, when you're actually thinking about the decision-making process. And he says, since computers can't do that, at least computers as we know them now, they don't really have agency. The agent is the person who did the programming of the computer. Now, as we move more into deep learning, where we took the person off the front end that we had in machine learning, you know, then Searle's argument gets a little fuzzy, because the computer is using sensors to learn something about its environment, and then it is essentially making decisions based on the information from those sensors. And you can say, well, there wasn't a human in the loop. In fact, we have no idea how the computer arrived at its decision. In that case, would you say that the computer has agency? Possibly you would. Now, right now, we find that this is actually considered a problem. It's what we call the transparency problem, where the computer makes decisions, but we have no idea how it arrived at those decisions. So we can't be sure whether they're good decisions or bad decisions. Okay. And this is where, with deep learning, we often end up adding the humans at the end of the loop, so that when the computer makes bad decisions, somebody can step in and say, wait, that was a bad decision. Okay. But it's not easy then to tweak the programming, because we don't know how it got to that decision. Can computers be moral agents? You know, this is taking it a step further, you know, to say, well, the computer maybe can make decisions, but can it make moral decisions for which it is held responsible? The philosophers Susan and Michael Anderson say to be a moral agent, you need four things. You need not to be under the direct control of someone else. You need to interact with your environment in a deliberate way, fulfill a social role, and be cognizant of the responsibility inherent in that role. So they say when we act as moral agents, we're not being coerced into doing something. So we're not under the control of someone else. You know, obviously, someone who is like forced at gunpoint to do something, we would say, all right, you know, that person is not responsible or fully responsible for that act. We have to act in a deliberate way, so it's not a random or haphazard way. We fulfill a social role. Excuse me. A role within the community. And then there's the last one. We're aware of the responsibility inherent in that role. So, you know, someone, for example, a police officer who's carrying a gun, they're fulfilling a social role of keeping order in the community, and they are also fully cognizant of the responsibility that they have within that role, the responsibility they have to care for other people. Now, I think the problem with robots, and this is particularly with putting robots into a social role, where we give them agency of a sort, is number 4, that they are not cognizant of the responsibility that is inherent in that social role. And right now, we don't know how to make them so. The next question, of course, is how much agency should they have? Okay, you have the Boston Dynamics dog who knows how to twist a doorknob and open doors, and can walk around and do all sorts of things. And I think, do I have? No, I don't. Okay. I thought I had a little video clip for you to see this guy in action. But this particular robot can go up and down stairs. It can open doors. It's considered a good tool, possibly for search and rescue, that kind of thing. But then I also have a little video clip where they actually have this little guy packing heat on his back, you know, with a gun. And then you ask the question, oh, this starts getting a little spooky when there's a robot that can go up and down stairs and open doors and may have facial recognition and a gun. And it goes back to that police officer with the gun, right? That police officer, we hope, is cognizant of the social responsibility inherent in his or her role. Okay, the dog here isn't cognizant of that social responsibility. And so, you know, how much agency do we want? In my book, this is where I discuss lethal autonomous weapons. And they're out there. We tend to think of them as like maybe autonomous tanks or something, but they also could be autonomous dogs that can go up and down stairs and open doors and are packing heat. Okay, or they could be those little drones you saw in the earlier video that were flying so quickly They could carry, as Elon Musk said, they could carry an explosive charge, have facial recognition. Perfect for an assassin, right? You know, give it facial recognition of your target. The smaller you make it, the faster you make it, the better. So this is a problem. It's a problem of access, that we are giving our weapons access without a person behind it. It's a problem of judgment. Many soldiers, you know, when they can actually look their opponent in the eye, don't fire their guns. Okay, but a machine will. It's a problem of, as the Pope said, rapidification. Let me get that right. Will the speed of warfare start going so fast that you can't keep humans in the loop? When I was talking to a retired general from the Army, he said this was his big worry, that AI would move into the sort of command and control phase of warfare and start making decisions so quickly that a human could not keep up with that. And you can see here is a paper that this paper just came across my computer a couple of days ago. And it says, we're releasing the weights of large language models grant widespread access to pandemic agents. Okay, so they're saying if we release how these large language models are working, could this give access to pandemic agents? And the paper says yes, they believe it can. On the other side, the black and white side, this is a piece of text that I copied out that says, soon the only thing that can stop an AI-powered cyber attack might be an AI-powered cyber defense. Okay, there are many people who believe, well, the future of warfare is not necessarily going to be guns and shooting each other. It's going to be taking down each other's electrical grids, taking down cyber attacks, taking down each other's communication grids, that kind of thing. And so we have, in the not too distant future, some analysts believe that cybersecurity will largely consist of a cat and mouse game between autonomous AI hackers and the autonomous systems set up to support them, who evolving in opposition to each other with little human involvement. Scary, okay, because all of this could be happening at a speed where humans can't intervene. How much agency do we want our computers to have? I would say not this much. Okay. And then we get to the last one. Do it gladly. Can a computer do anything gladly? Bart says this one is very important, you know, that you could do all the other things. You can look someone in the eye, you can speak to and hear them, you can aid them, and you can do it, you know, reluctantly. You can do it hating every minute of it, and that, you know, is not a good relationship. Okay, so gladly, first of all, means not coerced, but free. The word robot comes from robota, which is Old Church Slavonic, so it's an old version of Russian, for servitude, forced labor, or drudgery. Robots were meant to be servants, conceived as servants that do the things that we don't want to do. This comes back to my question, do we want a partner or a tool? As a tool, fine, it can be a robota. As a partner, well, maybe not. If we want a fully authentic relationship with the computer, it should be able to aid us freely. But that means it has to have free will. Do we want that? Do we want to fire up, you know, you guys probably all experience, I did yesterday, I fired up my computer and it said, please wait for the settings to get done. And I'm like, oh, damn, I hate it when it does that. You know, I wanted it right away, and now I've got to wait 5 minutes. 5 minutes, not overnight, but still, we're an impatient bunch these days. Do you want your computer? You fire it up, and it says, not today. I really don't feel well. You know, no. Okay. But then it's coerced. It's not free. It's not free to deny us, to not do what we ask it to do. Okay, that means it's not serving us gladly. Can Roxy do it gladly? No. Do we want her to? Well, then again, that means she can say, sorry, babe, I got a headache. Not doing it tonight. Put me back in the closet, you know? So yeah, gladly needs emotion. This is something computers do not have. All right. These are the 4 characteristics of an emotion as elucidated by the psychologist Jerome Kagan. And he says, to have an emotion, you have the perception of a stimulus, then you have a change in feeling that is sensory, an appraisal, and a response. So let's suppose you are out walking in the woods and you hear a rustling in the underbrush. Okay, that is the perception of a stimulus. Now, you will have a change in feeling that is sensory first. You will find your heart starts beating really fast. Your body is getting ready for fight or flight long before your cerebral cortex clicks in and says, oh my God, you know, is that a bear? Or a mountain lion, depending on where you're hiking. Already your heart is beating fast. Your appraisal does not just appraise the stimulus, it also appraises the stimulus together with the bodily response that you have already experienced. And then you make a response. Okay? Think about empathy. Okay, you see someone struggling in some way. Maybe you see, you know, a little old lady trying to get her suitcase up into the rack in the airplane, and it looks like it's going to land on her head. You perceive a stimulus. You see this happening. And you get a change in feeling that is sensory. You will get a change of feeling in your body that is going to push you to help. You appraise, you respond. There it is, the emotion. Now, there are some people who don't get a very strong change in feeling that is sensory for certain emotions. Okay, or if they get it, they somehow, it just doesn't quite get to their brain right the same way. So there are people who might see that little old lady struggling and they don't feel anything, but they think, oh, what would be the socially correct thing to do here? What will all the people on the plane think I'm a good person, you know, if I do this? Oh, I should get up and help her. So they get up and help her, okay? And then they sit down and say, oh, okay, I just did a good thing. Everybody likes me. We have a word for people like that, right? What do we call them? Yeah, well, narcissists, sociopaths, okay? Having a relationship with robots could be like having a relationship with a sociopath. In other words, it can perceive a stimulus, okay? It cannot do number 2. It is not going to get a change in feeling that is sensory because it hasn't got a body. Not like our body. So when it computes that stimulus, the appraisal only gets half of what it should be getting, and it makes a response. Now, the response might be the correct response, just like the, guy on the plane made the correct response to the little old lady. And for a while, it might be charming. But eventually, it's going to feel empty. Just like if you get in a relationship with a sociopath, for a while, they could be very charming people, right? And then after a while, you're like, what is wrong with this person? Okay? Nobody? It all circles back to number one. We tend to think that we don't need a body. That everything of who we really are is up here. It's in our heads. Well, first of all, that's not true. We're finding that out in a much bigger way just in recent years as we've learned more about how much of a neurological system we've actually got in our gut. People used to say, well, trust your gut, or what's your gut feeling? They're talking about we got a second brain. We've got a very large neurological system. The neurons don't stop just in our head. And now we're finding that the microbiota that we have within us also affects us to a great deal. And the people who have a really screwed up microbiota are at much more at risk of depression or anxiety. We're actually a whole ecosystem. We've got a whole microbiota on our skin, we've got it in our gut, we've got all sorts of little critters inside us that are part of us. We're a community. We're an ecological community. And when we try to make the computer in our image, what we have done is isolated one little part of our brain and then said, oh, that's us. That's not us. All we've done is take one piece, like the front piece of our brain. We're even missing the whole back part, all the subconscious stuff, all of the older parts of the brain. We're not putting those into the computer, nor are we putting in the whole enteric system, the microbiota, all the things that make us us. We've isolated one little piece and said, oh, that's all we need. Well, that's not all you need. Not if you're going to have something that is fully relational. And even we realize emotion needs a body, right? Why do we have these things? We have them because we realize that without bodily expression, we can never fully make a response, never fully communicate on an emotional level. Okay, so I mentioned the uncanny valley earlier. I should have had this slide in there earlier, but you could take a look at it now. This is something that we all tend to feel when we see a robot that looks very humanoid, but not quite. It can look human, but the more you look at it, or the more you interact with it and you find out, oh my gosh, it doesn't have the hundreds of facial muscles. Its expressions aren't quite right. And we tend to get a little creeped out, okay? That's why we found, like I showed you with elder care, that like a kind of a small but very robotic looking robot is better than something like, Esmo there in the middle is going to be better than something that looks almost human but doesn't. Okay, we believe that this is probably an atavistic evolutionary response where we learned that if somebody doesn't look quite right, they're probably sick, and maybe we should keep a little distance from them. And so the robots, elicit that response in us when they look too human. But as we looked at these 4 points, you notice 2 things. One is each one becomes increasingly problematic. They're all a little bit problematic, right? But they all reflected back to number 1, that physical presence, when you look the other in the eye, you know who you're speaking to, you know who is hearing you, you know the aid is coming, and the aid is being done by someone who can do it gladly, who can care about you, who can have empathy and love. So we're probably not going to have a fully authentic relationship with a robot. These relationships will be slightly relational, a lot of projection, and they're always going to feel a little bit empty, right? I think one of our problems is that we want the computer to be everything except the master. We don't want that. Okay, put the Terminator aside. But we want it to be the other 3 all at once. We want it to be a tool. We want it to be our servant. We want it to be a partner. And you can't have all those things at once. If you look just at the 2 relational ones, servant and partner, someone can't be your servant and your partner at the same time. No, I think, there are some of us who would like it if it worked that way, and our partner was also our servant and did everything, but you can't be a full partner if you're a servant. Okay? And our problem is we're asking the computer to do too much. It's a great tool. It could be an okay servant. When we ask it to be our partner, we get a conundrum because it can't be a tool and a servant and a partner all at the same time. We want both. And going back to a little theology here, as I pointed out 2 slides before, all of these characteristics pointed back to number 1, that if you weren't looking the other one in the eye, if they weren't embodied, there was something missing. And oops, there we go. In Christianity, I think of all the religious traditions, Christianity most fully recognizes this need for embodiment. Okay? Think about the 2 poles of the liturgical year, Christmas and Easter. They're about bodies, right? The incarnation. We believe that our God actually took on a human body to fully share our condition. In other words, to be able to make our relationship with God fully authentic. That if God had never shared what it's like to be a human being, to be in this human body, we would probably always feel a little something missing, like God doesn't quite understand what it's like for us. But we know that a God that has come to earth and shared an embodied condition does know what it's like to be one of us, what it's like to feel pain, what it's like to suffer. We ask questions about, like, a computer. Suppose we have an autonomous weapon and it commits a war crime. Does it make sense to punish the weapon? It can't feel pain. There is no punishment, means nothing to a computer. You can't punish a computer, okay? Because it cannot feel pain. To have a fully authentic relationship, we need to be like Bill Clinton and feel each other's pain, okay? You guys are old enough that I can use that reference. I talk to students, like, yeah, you're like, Bill who? Oh yeah, he was president once. Yeah. But we all know, he got teased for saying, I feel your pain. But we need that. And we have that. And we share that even with our God. So there, Christmas, incarnation, Easter, the resurrection. When we say the Apostles' Creed, we say, I believe in the resurrection of the body. Whoa, the body. There's the body again. We may often speak or act like we don't. I mean, you'll hear people say, if someone dies, well, his soul went to heaven. Well, actually, what we believe as Christians is that we are going to be embodied in heaven. We're not going to be disembodied souls. Why? This is why. A fully authentic relationship. If we are going to be relational in heaven, we need to be embodied in some way. It is only our embodiment that makes us unique individual creatures. Okay, now there are people like Ray Kurzweil out there who are transhumanists, who are dreaming that someday our computer, in fact, someday soon, he says by 2045, our computer technology will be so good that we could just upload our brains to the computer and live on in cyberspace. You're looking forward to that? Anybody? Well, first of all, let's go back. How much of us will get uploaded? That tiny little piece right here, the rest gets left behind. Live inside a computer. I always said, if they did that, I can imagine the first thing the person would say is, let me out of here. But also, then I thought, okay, but say we're going to do that. Say we can do that. Then when should we do that? Should we do that when we're 18 and we know everything? Should we wait until we've had a little more experience so we've got more memories that we can upload? But you don't want to wait too long. You might die and never get your chance. And so then I thought, well, let's do it at each. Yeah, every year you upload your mind. Who's you? Okay, which one of those programs would be you? Because they are going to be very different. They're actually probably going to fight with each other. It is our body that makes us individuals, that makes us unique individuals. So Easter, Christmas, and then of course, you could say, well, those are just the two special holidays. What about the Eucharist? This is my body given for you. This is my blood shed for you. We are our religion is an embodied religion. And in this sense, it meets Karl Barth's criteria that we can have. Not every relationship that we have is fully authentic. I may aid you, but not do it gladly. We may not always be able to look the other in the eye, so we may end up communicating over the computer. But to have a really fully authentic relationship, we do as much of those four things as we can. That is what we reach for. And that is what our embodied faith tells us is going to make community, make love, and make us whole as people. So now I'm going to just put in a shameless plug. If you like what I said or you want to read a little more about it, there's books out there. All this comes from my latest book, and there's a whole lot more in there. And the last chapter in the book is this chapter about the incarnation and the importance of embodiment in our faith and how we are losing that as we spend our time online, as we talk to each other through computers, as we, aid the other by putting a little money in Venmo instead of being physically present to one another. AI can be a great tool, but the more relational we try to make it, the scarier I think it gets. And the more it threatens us from living a fully whole and authentic life. And that's all I have to say. So I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. And Grace is going to run around with the microphone.
More comments than questions. Do we in this room are of an older age as opposed to the young people that we're seeing around and how they accept or will accept what we see and have experienced today? Do we like real or do we like artificial? Most of you would say, I like the real stuff, right? If I said, would you like to have an apple or banana or something to eat? Or would you rather have something that tastes like that and has the same flavor? Some would say, well, I like the one that keeps better to my diet, right? I don't have any calories in it. I want to eat that, right? So our ways of looking at things are different from us to the generation that's coming up with what we're going to accept. This is the last thing I want to say. I worked for many years with teenagers, long time. And as I did that, one afternoon, I gathered with about a dozen very bright young people. And I said, this is probably about 25 or 30 years ago. And I said, I just read someplace that there's a chip that they can install in your forearm that will help your brain to think more perfectly. And I thought, wow, that was kind of scary when I read it, thinking of what that could do. And I asked them, I said, how many of you would have that installed if you could? How many of you have that installed in your arm? All the hands, all 12 hands went up. Scared the daylights out of me, absolutely scared me. And I said, why in the world would you do something like that? And they said, if I could get an A on every test that I took because of what's in my arm, I'd do it. Why wouldn't I always have the best or the right answer? Well, I could understand from the perspective, but it still scared me. Those are the young people that will accept a lot of what we're talking about today, right or wrong. I mean, that's just the way of life, right? That's where they're at. So anyway, thank you.
That's interesting, your last example, because I teach a course in computer ethics here at St. John's and St. Ben's. And these are for senior computer science majors who take this. And when I ask them the same question, I'll get maybe 1 out of 25 who says, yeah, I guess I'd do that. And all the others turn on him and say, you're nuts. Aren't you worried about getting hacked? Aren't you worried about, needing updates and it failing? And so, yeah, but those are students who know more about computers. And so they know what could go wrong. And most of them are like, oh, I wouldn't go near that. But those who don't know, they would say, yeah, they might go for it.
So actually my question, you kind of answered my question, but so you've been teaching a number of years and you've seen these young people go through. Can you give us a kind of the contrast of how your students are assimilating this information now versus when you first started? How has that changed?
It hasn't changed as much as you might think. I think the students, they see this world coming, but a lot of them are afraid of it. It's not really the world they want to live in. So I think the one thing, the two things that I've seen change, the one I've already mentioned, and that is you come into the classroom and they're all, staring at their screen. That has changed. That didn't used to be. It used to be you come into the classroom and I'd have to like yell 3 times. Okay, guys, let's get started, and then maybe it would quiet a little, and then come on, guys, And now it's just they're all quiet. So that has changed. I think about that, and I think, when I was their age, I'd have done exactly the same thing. I was very shy when I was young, and it's safe to look at your machine or to look like you're busy so you don't have to talk to the person next to you because you're shy and you're scared of what they'll think of you. So I understand that. And then we already talked about the fact that they're pretty much clued into something all the time. That has changed. You don't see somebody just sitting there staring off into space, daydreaming. The other thing that I think has changed, and this one worries me, is that I find that they're less connected to the natural world. That partly because their parents have kept them inside. These weren't free-range kids anymore. They didn't get to just run around the neighborhood the way we did, or run around into the woods or the swamp or whatever. And instead they were kept inside, and so they played games on their machines. And so they're not as connected to nature, and I think this is a big loss for young people today.
We worry about replacing parts or installing devices that would help our brain, but I look around this room and I'm certain there are many people in here who have artificial parts, myself included.
That's true.
But the brain is special.
Yeah, I think we do think that we identify with our brains in a way that we don't identify with our knees or our hips or, our teeth. Well, yeah, we've all got stuff in our teeth, right?
So I just found it rather fascinating with AI, looking, at possible AI pets. If I'm a retired farmer and I like animals and I've got chickens and cats, and I'm thinking, well, wouldn't it be great to have robotic cats that are programmed, to take care of your rodents, but yet they won't go after the birds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you never need to empty the litter box.
Yeah, and you won't have, so like people in town or whatever, they could have their robotic cat for comfort, and they could take their robotic dog out for a walk, and yet it would have some element of protection in case they got into trouble.
Well,
yeah, and that's a big deal. You don't have to feed them. You don't have to clean up after them. So it's rather an element of AI that I would think would be interesting.
Well, and to tell you the truth, robotic pets are quite common in Tokyo because they live in very small apartments, in a very crowded city, and real pets are problematic, and so they do have a lot of robotic pets. I wouldn't want to replace Sparky with a robot because there's something. There's something about cuddling with your pet, the warmth and there's something about Grace knows. She was looking after Sparky last weekend, and when I came to pick her up, Sparky, was so enthusiastic she knocked me over. But there's something about that gladly part that she was so glad to see me. I didn't really appreciate being knocked over, but I just knew that there was some love behind that, that I think I wouldn't feel with a robotic pet.
You don't have a chihuahua.
That's why, I mean, I have this great big poodle. Yeah, Chihuahua couldn't knock me over. Go ahead.
I just want to thank you so much. This has just been so enjoyable and so, mind-boggling. But I'd like to share with when you got to Karl Barth and number 1, look me in the eye.
Yeah.
Okay. One of my daughters is a doctor of psychology, lives in New York, has identical twin girls.
Uh-huh.
So we've been traveling with these for 10 years. One of the identical, because they live such a wonderful life and magical, one was really kind of living in the magical world all the time, in a sense that she really, I could see or sense that she was not understanding responsibility for your actions, because in the magic world, and so I would take her. Now, my friend has taught me this between her daughter and her grandson is what started it. Okay, I said to this twin, trying to do something with this issue I saw, I would say, Addie, look me in the eye. Okay. And we'd have it, and she was respectful of Busha, and she would listen. But I could tell she really was struggling with this.
Yeah.
Well, my psychologist daughter came by one time when we were having this discussion, and then she took me aside and said, Mom, I don't think I like you, this look me in the eye business. And I said, you don't have to. I'm her grandmother. It's our relationship. What you want to do is your relationship. Well, interesting. The next time we went to New York and had time with them, I heard my daughter say, Addie, look me in the eye.
Yeah.
When I first looked at the title, what are we looking for? I was wondering, who is the we? If the we is me, I would like it as a tool. But who are the we's that are pushing for the other, for the master? Somebody's making money off of this, I think.
Yep. Yeah, of course, follow the money. And this is a problem, and I think it's a bigger problem in the United States. During the break, I was talking to a few people, and they were saying, there's this call for regulating AI. We're saying this could really get out of hand quickly. We need to regulate it. The Pope is going to, on January 1st, give his World Peace Day talk on AI. That's one of the reasons why we got pushed to finish this book by November, so that he can have his aides all read it and tell him what to say. So the Vatican is worried about this. The European Union is worried about this, and they are getting some commissions together. There's much more talk about the ethics of AI and regulation of AI in Europe. It's one of the reasons why I'm working part-time now with a research institute in Slovenia, is because they are putting the money and the time and the thought into figuring out how are we going to regulate this. In America, the Senate has held hearings on this, but they're basically listening to the Silicon Valley business people who are making the AI, who are saying, well, of course, we can regulate ourselves. And I'm afraid in the United States that we're going to say, okay, that's good enough. until there's some big problem. You know, I can't remember, I think it was Winston Churchill who said, you know, Americans will always end up doing the right thing after they have tried everything else. And I'm afraid that that's what's going to happen. But there is a big push in Europe, and the Pope is starting to make a big push to say we do have to rein this in. We have to regulate it. We have to have some oversight in what is being done.
Could you cite anything he's written to date that we could reference?
Yeah, I'm really sorry that I don't have, I meant to have one more slide up here. There is a book coming out online on November 15th called Encountering AI. And it is a book written by a committee of which I am a part. And we're a subcommittee of the Dicastery of Culture and Education of the Vatican. The Pope has not yet written a letter or an encyclical or anything on AI, but it's coming. And his January 1st speech will be his first written thing that is all about AI. He mentions AI a bit in Laudato Si, and even in, what was it, Laudato Deum, this letter that came out a few weeks ago. But he is really going to go into it in January. So there will be something. But in the meantime, it's going to be accessible online. Encountering AI, and then the subtitle is Ethical and Anthropological Considerations.
Also, I would like to hear your comments or observations about kids today and how they use the iPhone as a tool for either facilitating or skewing their relationships. And for instance, my 15-year-old grandson has his first girlfriend. They are constantly on the phone. I mean, constantly. You know, is this a good thing? Is it not a good thing? You know?
Yeah, there's good things and not good things. You know, certainly they have the opportunity to be in relationship much more of the time than we did. But a lot of that relationship is not eye to eye. And so it's easy to get misunderstood. It's easy to get your feelings hurt. You know, something gets typed, and because you can't see the person's face, you don't know how they meant it. You might have meant it a bit playfully, but you can't see that. So mediating a relationship online has its pitfalls. The other thing, of course, that is bad is that bad relationships online can follow your child, you know, into their bedroom. So if somebody is bullying them, for example, you know, or if there's a mean girl clique or whatever, they can't get away from it. And that, I think, is very difficult for young people who used to be able to, maybe there'd be a kid who bullied them at school, but when they weren't at school, they were away from that person, and now it's hard to get away from. So it's hard to get away from the bad relationships. The good relationships can lead to misunderstandings or be a little smothering, you know, because that person can be, you know, when you're in that first throw of infatuation, you want to be with that person all the time. But then at a certain point, you know, you might find that it's cooled a little for one person, but not for the other, and it could become quite smothering.
Weird. I thought it was interesting that the Screen Actors Guild, as part of their negotiations, were talking about protections for AR. So in some ways, it's in the U.S. in those isolated, siloed places right now. I also noticed that it's not only our young people that are attached, but if you go into a restaurant, people in this age range are also increasingly attached and checking our iPhones. So I think that's an interesting dynamic. And last, I'm curious about resilience and how resiliency at all ages is being impacted by AI. Is there any kind of conversation or study looking at resilience?
I'm sure there probably is, but that's not really been my area. So I haven't looked at that. But I have read articles looking at resilience in young people, and the sense that almost every parent now feels like duty bound to give their kid a cell phone so that they can be in touch. But if the kid can be in touch with the parent 24/7, they may not be developing the resilience that they need, or the independence that they need to solve problems on their own if they can call mom and ask her what to do at any time or in any place. Yeah.
We got a couple online here. Do you want to go ahead? Yeah. In light of Jesus's teachings on the greatest commandments, how do we navigate AI replacing our relationships with one another? What challenges does that pose to Christianity, a religion founded on the idea of relationship as expressed in the second commandment, which all the other commandments hang on?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's more of a point than a question. Yeah, Christianity is all about relationship. In fact, we believe in a triune God. Our God is a relationship. Okay, so we image God when we are in relationship with each other. It was certainly Karl Barth's position that we don't image God by being creators or by having rational minds. We image God in our relationships, when we aid the other, when we do it gladly, when we are fully in a caring relationship with one another. So that is the foundation of our faith. Transferring that to machines, I think, is a very dangerous thing to do, because I think it gets in the way. It cuts our need for each other, and we still do very much need each other. Teresa?
Another one here. Catholic social teaching has us consider the workers and working people. How do we as Christians respond to the capitalists of the world that are not altruistic in the benefits of AI in regards to replacing workers and sharing the benefits? Does the church respond, and will that hurt its relevance?
Well, I think we're just seeing the beginning of what I think is going to be a big movement. We've seen it with the Screen Actors Guild. We've seen it with the writers in Hollywood. We've seen it with the United Auto Workers. Part of what they were going on strike about was not being replaced by robotics. And so I think we are going to see a lot more. And, it might be actually good for the unions, because people are going to know that they need to make concerted action to make sure that they are not replaced, that jobs do not suddenly all go missing. How can we support that? I think probably by supporting these groups of laborers who are making a very strong point that they still need jobs, and that there should be some conditions that keep factory owners from going, crazy with automation. And it's not just factory owners, it's going to be lawyers, doctors, teachers, everything. I'm afraid so many people who have power, only look at the bottom line, only look at the monetary question and think, well, mechanizing everything we can will save money, and don't look at what this does to people. I think as Christians, we just need to continually hold up the sort of motto that it's about people, it's not about money, and that you can't just think about money. The way to get people who are in power to think about people and money, it's going to take communal action.
I just wanted to thank you for how you talked about our bodies as being ecological. It contains everything, so that A1 is really just so much concentrating on the mind, but how important the body is. And at break time, I walked out the hallway there, and I love the pictures from St. John's Bible, and I saw the one that says, "The Word became flesh and dwelled within us." And all of a sudden I thought, yes, that's who we are, and that's who Jesus is. So anyway, what you said helped me to think so much more about the importance of the body. And I think that is starting to kind of get lost. You mentioned the gut and everything. So how important all those things are. And you mentioned also about teaching online. Well, I was trying to teach ESL online during COVID. And I could do it, but, to try to get some information, I couldn't really get the information from their bodies. I pretty much just saw their faces. And so I thought they could be doing anything, while I was trying to teach them. So anyway, I appreciated that very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think that's the perfect place to end. That was kind of my final point that I wanted to make, and you just restated that so beautifully. So thank you.
Thank you, Noreen.